But can I go back to the question you asked a minute ago? Because I'd love to hear these guys talk about the flip side of the questions of the relative optimism of blacks and Hispanics. It's the relative pessimism of whites. And so how do we explain that?
Well, first of all, I think you explain the whole poll in many ways by two macro developments: the economic crisis and the uncertain international situation. And I think the economic crisis deeply affected people's views of the American dream in many ways. And I think what we're seeing unfold now is just on top of what people, as you saw, I think it was such a large percentage that expected we would have a war with Iran, suggests that they have a very uncertain view about the international scene. Then as I think you go to the, a layer down, I think you're seeing that white America is very pessimistic. They're older, they feel more in a strange way, more alienated from the political system. Remember, if you were going to look at their numbers, they largely oppose the current president. African Americans and Latinos largely and overwhelmingly support the current direction the president's taking us in, right? And so there's a huge gulf here, both in outlook, in attitudes towards the president, and in attitudes towards where the country should be taken.
Let me ask about a different kind of gulf. We've talked about Hispanic and African American and white. There also seemed to be a gap between men and women that was interesting. And as I recall, women were much more pessimistic about affording college for their kids, about retirement, about vacations, yet men didn't share that. I mean, what does that say?
There's a whole litany of those things that you might think of as the building blocks of the American dream, except for home ownership, which wasn't in there. That you look at women and they are substantially more pessimistic about the ability to afford those things in the future than men are. And I was surprised by that, in part because when we think about the recession and the economic circumstances, men, I think, were hit very hard, if not harder, in terms of unemployment and loss of jobs than women were. We tend to think of women now as kind of beginning to sort of move and come to the fore much more in the job market than has been the case in the past. And yet there is this fundamental, I think, uncertainty and anxiety about things. The one that I point to is the ability to afford a vacation, which is a very basic thing, and they're worried about that.
Right. The biggest gap, I think, was college education. I would say that this is what's unusual about this finding is that it persists. So whereas the Latino and African American finding is a complete reversal of what I saw in 40 years of polling, in 40 years of polling, women were always, in every poll, more concerned about the economic situation. And so largely, if I went back to when I started polling, the answer to that would have been that men largely controlled the economic futures. And women were not a huge earning force. Most women were not in the workforce at the time.
Now it just means men are more oblivious.
So now,
delusional, I think.
Right, but now you would have expected that because women are solidly in the workforce, you would have thought that that perception gap might have closed and that men and women would have more equal views. But you don't. Men typically get in more car accidents and have more drug overdoses because they are more overconfident generally. And women are less confident than men, and therefore I think you see that reflected in the poll, and that trend continues, right? Unabated, I think, in the last 40 years if I went back.